I'm so excited to finally be able to present to you the All Too Well scarf pattern. It is a really simple single row repeat all the way through once you've established your first row. So for this one I'm going to be working using a 4.5mm hook and a DK weight yarn. I am using Starcraft Special DK in Claret. It's just a nice deep red, bit more autumnal, not too bright either. Okay, so to get going, you're going to start by making a slip knot. I like to describe this as if you're making a normal knot and you're tucking that yarn over, but rather than sticking the end through, you're sticking a loop through and making sure that yarn tail end doesn't come through. You want to make sure that your loop on your hook isn't too tight, so you can move it nice and freely up and down your hook, but it's not so loose either. You want it to be so that the teardrop shape of that loop fits your hook through it nicely. So now I'm going to be holding my yarn. I only hold my yarn in the bottom 3 fingers, and I use my index finger and thumb to do my yarn overs. I then put my index finger in front of that loop so that I can keep that space. So as I turn my hook to pull the loop through, it's keeping the tension nice and even, and it's also allowing for that loop to catch nicely under the hook. So that is my first chain that I've completed there, and we're not counting the loop on our hook. So to do your chain, you are yarning over, making sure that you're keeping that working yarn out towards the back so it's not slipping down the front. I'm keeping my finger in the front of it so that as I twist my hook it catches nicely, and as I'm holding on to the previous stitch as well. So you see here I've got my finger in front of that yarn and I'm pinching onto the previous stitch so that as I pull through it's not going to tighten it. I'm keeping that yarn behind that finger there so that as I twist my hook, as you can see here, there's still enough of a gap between it, so the only yarn that I'm catching is the working yarn. It's not the loop that's already on my hook, so I don't get caught. And I twist my hook around so that it's sitting same direction as the teardrop shape that is on my hook. So when you look at the loop that's on your hook, it will be a teardrop sort of shape, and when you look at your hook with the hook side facing downwards, you'll notice it's the same shape. So I work that chain, making sure to keep that space and catching that yarn before I pull it through to make sure that I'm not getting myself any tangled or too tight. If you do pull through too much of a loop, like I've done so here, my recommendation is to hold on to that previous stitch. If you're not going to undo it, hold on to that previous stitch and then pull on it. If you hold on nice and tightly, it means that the tension of that stitch isn't going anywhere. It's not going to pull tight. If you just pull on it tightly, you are going to make the chain before it tighten up as well. So just make sure that you're always holding on to that previous chain as you're working, because it will mean that you are keeping your tension nice and even. You don't want to be working up in the neck of your hook. You want to be pulling all of those loops down the full length of your hook onto the part that is the size of the hook. So we're pulling it onto, for this one, the part that is the 4.5mm. If we worked in that top bit, if we worked underneath the hook there, it would be too small and it will get too tight and you won't be able to pull your stitches through, and when you're working your chain in a moment, you won't be able to pull that part through, you won't be able to get your hook in, and you won't be able to pull back through quite so easily. You'll also find that if your chain is too tight, it will create a banana type shape, which is not what you want at all. You want your chain to be loose enough that when you've done your next row of stitches, it is sitting nice and straight. If you are finding that your chain is too tight and that you're finding it quite difficult to keep that more even tension with it, do size up your hook either by 0.5 or by a 4mm so that you can make sure that you're getting that nice tension on your chain. For this project, we are working 31 chains for the width that I am producing here, which is approximately about 7.5 to 8 inches wide, or about 19 to 20 centimetres. So you are getting a decent width for your scarf with these 30 stitches. If you'd like to make a skinnier scarf, simply do an even number plus 1, which I know sounds really silly, but your even number is your repeat. So you're working in multiples of 2 for the repeat of the stitches, whereas the 1 that you need as the additional is your turning chain that you will require at the beginning of each and every row that you do. So we're working in a multiple of 2 plus 1. If you again want to make your scarf wider, for every 10 centimeters or so, you're going to want to work approximately 15 stitches. Given that we've got 30 stitches wide for this one and it's coming out at about 20 centimeters, you're going to want, if you want every 10 centimeters, so every 5 centimeters is approximately 8 stitches. So if you do want to go wider, you'll simply add that number of stitches as you go. This is me just counting my chains. I will go through this momentarily with you, but I'm just checking how many I've got because I need to do a few more before I get to 31, just as a spoiler. So I'm just going to continue to work this chain. You are doing 31 chains if you're going with the width that I have produced, but again, you can work to a multiple of 2 plus 1. So just work to an odd number. If you're thinking about it in terms of your multiple of 2, then it's going to be your pairs of stitches. So I'd like to work to like around even number, if that makes sense. So working to your 10s, 10s, 20s, 30s. But if you do, want to just add a little bit more width, you can do. The tension isn't the most important with this project, so it's not the end of the world if it is more or less than that, but we'll come to that in a little while. So here we go. This is my chain here. It is long enough that it is sticking off the bottom of the shot, but don't worry, I am going to show you now how you will count this. So you do not count the loop that is on your hook. You will start by counting the bumps that you see, so the V's that have formed on your chain that you can see here. You're going to count each one of those, and only one side of it. That may sound silly, but I've come across it before. So you're going to count down the bumps. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, etc, etc, etc. I'm not going to count you all the way through, but I am going to point to every single stitch so you can kind of get my meaning here. You can see where you've got the interlocking V's, so they're not quite the perfect V. They don't like come together like they would with knitting. There is a slight underlap overlap going on, and I'll show you the back momentarily as well so you can see what's going on there, so you can see the difference as well. But the front part of your chain, the part that will face you as you work, looks like this series of interlocking V's. So here you can see the back of your work once it comes back into shot. This is me trying to fiddle with it to make it do what I want it to do because it did not want to turn around. So what you'll see on the back of your work is, rather than interlocking V's, it will almost look like a W. So you get the kind of the two edge sides, but then there's also this part that comes over the top of the middle. So you're getting that extra bit of your stitch, which is known as the back bump. You can work underneath the back bump when you're working your chain, but for this I'm just going to show you how to basically work across the chain. So now we're working on row 1. So row 1 is then going to be the same for all the other rows, but we're working into the chain so it gets said slightly differently. So for this one, we're going to work 1 double crochet, that's a single crochet for the US, into the second chain from our hook. So not counting the chain on our hook, or the loop on our hook, you count 2 bumps along, and then you're going to work under one side of that loop. So you can see where it's moving along there and just going underneath one side. So you end up with those 2 loops on your hook. Then you're going to yarn over, making sure to keep that yarn to the back as you work, and then pull up a loop, which means simply pull it back through the hole you've just come through. So where you've stabbed in towards the back, you're going to pull it back out towards the front. So if you'd stabbed them with a sword, they'd be very dead. Then to complete your double crochet with your 2 loops on your hook, you're going to yarn over and pull through both of those loops. You want to make sure that you aren't catching 2 loops at once to pull through, and that you are doing one loop at a time. Essentially, you will get the knack of where you are going through 2. You're going to follow this double crochet through a US single with a treble crochet, so a US double, and you're going to work it into the next chain along. We aren't skipping any of our chain stitches, so you will see when you're looking at it that your stitch pulls on the chain that you've just worked into. So you can see in the middle there that slightly bigger gap. You're then going to follow that one that's being pulled on, you're going to follow it into the next hole along. So here I'm just showing what happens if you have your yarn down the front, and you will end up tangling it underneath. So you want to make sure you are working that yarn around the back, because if it is draping down the front and you catch it underneath, you are going to just give yourselves all sorts of twists and turns, and it's just going to confuse you later. So you do want to make sure that you're keeping that yarn out towards the back, and the main way that you can do this is to keep that finger in front of it at all times when you're working these stitches. So here for our treble, we have our yarn over, and I'm holding on to the chain so that I can then follow the previous stitch. So here I am going to get my handy needle to show you. I remember what I filmed. So we're going to follow where it's pulling on that previous chain. When you pull on the stitch that you've just done, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see it pulling on that piece of chain. You're then going to follow the chain that your previous stitch is wrapped around into the next hole along. That's the hole where you're going to be putting your hook. So now what you're going to do with your yarn over, you're going to insert your hook. So you have 2 loops already because you've yarned over, and you're going to insert through the chain. So now you can see you've got 3 loops on your hook. Then you're going to yarn over, and I like to hold on to the chain as I then guide it through. So like I did when I was creating the chain, I hold on to the chain, so as I'm pulling my stitches through it, it's keeping the tension as even as possible. Then once you've got your 3 loops, because you've pulled up a loop, which means just pulling it back through, you're going to yarn over again, so you've got 4 loops on your hook, and you're going to pull that first loop that you've just yarned over through the next 2 loops on your hook, making sure to do them one at a time. You will reach a part where you can just pull it through both at once, and that's fine, but just for now make sure you're pulling through one at a time, because you do end up pulling 2 through 1. It's going to get really tight for you, it's not going to finish the stitches correctly, and you will end up with 2 loops at the end of your stitch rather than the 1. So it's good to remember with your treble crochet, your US double crochet, that it's not over until you've got 1 loop left on your hook. If you've still got 2 loops left on your hook, you haven't yarned over enough, or you haven't pulled through enough loops. So that is the 2 stitches you're going to be working for this row. So now we're going back to our double crochet, your US single crochet, and inserting our hook before yarning over. Yarning over to pull up a loop. With our 2 loops on our hook, we're yarning over to pull straight through those 2. Now we're back to our treble crochet again, our US double. So we're yarning over first, following the chain through so we can stick our hook through, yarn over to pull up a loop, pull it back through, and then yarn over and pull through 2, and then yarn over again and pull through 2. And that is the pattern you're going to follow for this entire scarf. It's just going 1, 2, 1, 2. Single, double for the US, double, treble for the UK. So we're going to keep working as you go, and you will start to be able to recognise the shorter double stitch versus the bigger treble stitch, and I will show you a bit later how it is a bit more obvious once you get going. So you want to be making sure that with your treble stitch you are yarning over before you go in, so that once you've pulled back through and you've yarned over, you've got your 4 loops, and then you're going to pull through 2, yarn over and then pull through 2. So then once you're back to your double, you're going to insert your hook, yarn over to pull up a loop, and pulling up a loop just means pull back through. Here I've come straight back through both stitches at once. I haven't come back through the chain and then gone through 2. So I've just pulled straight through everything, which is actually a slip stitch. So if that happens, just simply undo your work and make sure at this point when you've got those 2 loops that you're yarning over and then pulling through 2 again. The other thing that people do is they keep yarning over and just kind of making this secondary chain situation. So they yarn over and pull through 1, and yarn over and pull through 1. What you want to make sure that you're doing is inserting your hook, yarning over to pull up your loop, so you've got your 2 loops, and then yarning over and pulling through the 2. So the way that you can see that you've come back through that chain is because your chain will be over that working yarn there. So you could see where it was pulling on the chain with your working yarn. When you pull through just the 1 loop, so here I'm showing you in fact that I've pulled the 2 loops through, and you end up with this more of a knot on there, your 2 loops on there, they're very tight because they're being held by the 1, and you've almost created a slip stitch rather than a double crochet or a single crochet for the US. So you want to make sure that you are inserting your hook into the stitch, yarning over, so then you've got your 3 loops there, pulling through 1, so you've got 2 loops again, then yarning over and pulling through 2, one at a time, making sure you're not catching two loops at once. Then for your treble, you want to yarn over before you insert your hook, yarn over to pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through 2. Now similarly, I do see people forgetting to pull up a loop, and pulling through many chain, like doing the yarn overs and kind of creating a secondary chain. You get the same mistakes with those all the time. So do check out your guide. I do go into more detail about what these mistakes look like. And you're going to follow along the chain doing the double, then treble, then double, then treble. So you want to make sure with your treble, when you've inserted your hook, you'll have these 3 loops, and you can see that it is your chain that your hook is in. It's pulling on what you've already got there. Whereas when you yarn over and pull through, when you see that loop and it's got that piece of yarn and the yarn is pulling on the chain, that's when you've come back through the chain, and this is when you want to yarn over and pull through two. You don't want to do that pull through two when one of those two is the chain. You always want to make sure you're doing the pull up a loop phase of the stitch. So here you can see on my working yarn there is only one loop on it. This means that I still need to pull through one more loop. When I've pulled through two loops, you can see that there are two loops on my working yarn. Can you see? Then that means that I just need to do another yarn over and pull through two. So yarning over and going through the loops on my hook. And again, you can always tell when you have done one yarn, pulled through one or pulled through two, because when you look at that working yarn, you can see the number of loops that you've gone through because it will be resting over the top of the working yarn. So now you can see there, I have two, and I can move on to my next stitch. Remember with your treble and with your double that your stitch is only over when you've only got one loop left. I have so many people try and move on to the next stitch when they've only done the first pull through two with their treble. So do remember to yarn over and pull through that second two. Don't forget to do it. So here I'm just showing you that that's what people do. They move on to the next one and then they just move on and move on and move on, and they try and just crochet the beginnings of the trebles so many times, and they end up with all these loops on their hooks, which is a stitch in its own right, don't get me wrong, but it's not the stitch that we're doing. So they end up with this kind of weird concoction and one loop from half a row back, and you just want to make sure that you're always finishing your stitch, that you are going back to that one loop. It is fairly straightforward to unpick it. You literally just hold on to the loop or stick my hook back into the loop that I'm working in, and then you can just go back to where you were. There is a way to kind of unpick some of the loops and leave something you've done, but it's a bit complicated, and it's just much easier to make sure that you are finishing those stitches correctly. This is me showing you again how you can then actually lift that off. So I've not taken all the stitches back. I am taking out the start of the next stitch so that I can get this yarn over, but I've not undone that stitch so that you lose it completely. So now I'm going back to doing the double crochet, the US single crochet for the next stitch. And this is the pattern, as I say, it's literally those two stitches, this row, the next row after that. This whole pattern is just made up of these two stitches, one after another. And because we're working in an even number, you start and end the rows on the same stitches, because you do end up putting your trebles into the top of your doubles and your doubles in the top of your trebles to get that nice bobbly texture. So that's why I call it a moss stitch, because it looks like a knitted moss stitch. I know there's another crochet stitch that also looks like a knitted moss stitch, but this one to me is the most common one. And it's the easiest one to do as well. And it's much like knitting where you're kind of swapping between the two stitches. That's what you're doing here. Other people will refer to this, as I found out, and you may have seen my reel, other people call this a grit stitch, which I kind of get. It does look a bit asphalty. It also gets called the lemon peel stitch, which my friend said to me ages ago. She was doing a lemon peel stitch, and I was like, what is that? And she didn't tell me what it was, but I didn't realise that was this. And then the other thing that people call it is a granite stitch. But a granite stitch is also what people refer to as a linen stitch, which also they refer to as a moss stitch. It's a completely different thing. So you can feel the anxiety with us crocheters when we're naming things, because everything is named 5 different things. The terminology between the US and the UK is similar but completely different. And yeah, it's easy to get very, very confused very, very fast with what you're doing. So don't worry if you are a beginner and you are struggling to come to terms with it, because everybody calls things something different. I call this a moss stitch. I will accept a lemon peel stitch for it, and I will accept a grit stitch for it. I won't accept a granite stitch for it because I just don't think it looks like granite. So yes, there are so many different names for all of the different stitches. I will try and list them all on the page as well so that you kind of understand what's going on. But yes, this is one of those where it's got 5,000 different names. So I am coming to the end of this first row now. I'm getting to the end of my chain. So just working to these last few stitches now, remembering we are doing a double, then a treble. So your double, going straight in, and then for your treble, you are yarning over first before you insert your hook. Remember to always yarn over and pull up a loop back through your chain or the top of your stitch before you then do a yarn over and pull through 2 of these stitches, because otherwise you'll end up with a very tight situation going on. And I'm sure it, in this situation it's going to look fine, but it's not quite right. So if you do find yourself getting a bit lost with your stitches, the easiest way to kind of tell if you're doing a treble next or a double next or a single for the US and double for the US is to look at the stitch itself, the one that you've just done. For your treble stitch, you will see this kind of 2 lots of stitch together. So here you've got this kind of first level of the stitch and then the second level where you've done through 2 and then yarning over and through 2. With your double, you will only have 1 set of that. So here I'm just doing this final double here, and then we are going to be going into this last chain. You're not going into the slip knot, but you're going into the chain stitch before the slip knot. So yarning over to insert your hook, pulling up a loop. Remember to always pull up a loop. I can't stress it enough. Yarning over to pull through 2 and then through 2. Ooh, that's me just catching the yarn tail there. Then I just like to pull on that yarn tail because we did use an adjustable loop at the beginning, so of course it will get loose and it can be tightened. And that is the end of our first row. So I'm just going to remove my hook here just so I can show you what is going on. So can you see that there are some gaps? You can see there are holier bits at the bottom, and then it's quite uniform because of where you're skipping your stitches. So you can see at the bottom there are these gaps, there are these holes. That is where your double crochet, your single crochet for the US, is pulling on the chain more because it wants to sit at the height of the treble stitch next to it. So it's pulling on it because it wants to be involved in the tall person party. So me as a tiny person, it's wanting me to be 6 foot tall, What you'll also be able to notice is that when you isolate the stitches, so if you put your thumbs either side, here you can see that there's only one part of the stack for this stitch in the middle. That is our double crochet, and the ones next to it will look a lot fuller. Again, you want to make sure that you're kind of looking for these gaps. That is a signifier of these double crochets. And then if you isolate the stitches, so I like to look either side of it, and if it looks nice and full like this one, and it's got those kind of 2 sides of the stitch, if it's starting to kind of poke its butt out a bit, that is your treble crochet, your US double crochet. And then the one next to it is going to be a sparser looking stitch, and that in itself is the double crochet. So you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping up to that every other stitch. It doesn't matter massively if you do miss 1 or 2 and it goes slightly awry, because at the end of the day, who's going to be looking that closely at it anyway? So when we're looking at the backs of these stitches, it does look slightly different. So as we work across, you are going to start to see some difference. For instance, the top of the stitch, you have that secondary bar, which is what we're going to be following along in order to find the top of our stitches. So you can see where those bumps are, and then on your trebles there is the kind of secondary bump at the bottom as well. So we want to be following these parts of the stitches in our next row, and we will be doing alternate stitches. So we ended on a treble stitch, so we're going to begin like we did with row 1 with a double stitch. So for the US, we'll be starting with a single. So hopefully you can kind of see the difference now, that between the bigger stitches and the smaller stitches there is quite a noticeable difference between the two. If you are getting confused, don't worry, just take some time to look at what you've got there and start to recognize the signs. So now we're going to be moving on to our next row. Because we're starting with a double crochet, a US single crochet, we're going to only need to chain 1 for our turning chain. I like to do this before I turn my work, others like to do it after they've turned their work, and some like to do that chain and take the end of the hook out and then go back. It's mad. As I say, there's lots of ways to do everything. So we're going to avoid that very first loop after our hook, because that is the chain that we've just done. And we're going to follow that horizontal bar into the top of the treble crochet that we have just done. So you're looking at this bar here. I'm going to get my needle so that I can show you what I mean. So this is obviously the loop that's on our hook. This second one here is the chain that we've just done, and then this horizontal bar that you can see underneath the top of the V, that is where we're going to follow. So this one here is the next stitch along, so we want to be following that very first horizontal bar into that hole underneath both parts of the top of the stitch. So we're working underneath both loops, which is the standard with crochet stitches unless otherwise stated. So you'll make sure that you've got both parts of the top of the stitch, the V that sits across the stitch, you're going underneath both of those. So you're starting with that double crochet, then following that horizontal bar with your yarn over on your hook to do your treble crochet, your US double crochet, into the next stitch along. So you can see here that there are the 2 bars of the V of the top of our stitch. So the top of your stitch refers to both sides. You will be told if you're only working into one side of that, so you want to make sure you've got both of those. And then you're going to continue to finish your stitch as normal. It can get a bit confusing going between working the chain and then working the top of the stitch, because rather than having the 1 bar across from your chain when you're going under the stitch, you now have an extra bar. So here, last time we would have had 2 loops on our hook, we now have 3 because the top of that stitch has 2 parts to it, which I think is what confuses a lot of people when they're looking at what they should be doing next. So you do want to be making sure that you have those 2 parts at the top of your stitch on your hook, so that when you yarn over and you pull back through both of those, not just one. So then once you've pulled up your loop, you do end up with both loops, so 2 loops that you can then yarn over and pull through 2. We're then going to do, as you may well have predicted, a treble into the top of the next stitch. And you are working trebles into the top of the doubles from the previous row and doubles into the top of the trebles from the previous row, because you're working in the even number and we're starting with the same stitch that we started with in the last row and we end on the opposite stitch to that. So we are working, so here we're now going to be working a double crochet, a US single crochet, into the top of the next stitch. So you want to make sure that you're looking that it's that longer stitch. If you are confused, you can either look at the stitch you've previously done or the stitch that is beneath it. So working where that horizontal bar is telling us to put our hook underneath the top of both parts of the top of the stitch. It's so important that you go through both, because if you just go through one, A, the structural integrity of the piece won't be as solid as it will be when you go under both, and B, you'll end up with an extra bar across the top of some of your stitches on one of the sides, because if you've only gone through the top, or rather the front or the back loop only, then the front or the back loop that you haven't gone through is going to show on the surface of your work, which is not what we want. So here I've skipped forwards because I find it easier to be able to show you the differences once we've got a few rows worked here. So I'm just going to finish up this last row so that we can have a look at how you identify these stitches and what this stitch pattern looks like once it is worked up a bit more. Don't worry, I will show you momentarily how you can count your rows. I have here done 200 rows. That's right, 200 rows of 30 stitches in order to get the decent length for a scarf. Obviously, if you want to go longer, you can keep going, and if you want to do shorter, you can cut it short. If, for instance, you wanted to make more of a snood, you'd probably go for more like 125 to 150 rows instead. So to fasten off, I am just giving it a trim and then pulling the end back through the top of the stitch. Don't pull on the end so that you pull the loop out of the top of the stitch. Make sure you're pulling the yarn tail through the top of the stitch instead. So here we go. This is our finished rows. So you can really start to see very quickly, once you've kind of got a few rows of pattern, you can very quickly see what's going on with that stitch pattern. So you can see here that that you get this like continuous pattern going on. It becomes quite clear quite quickly, and both sides being the same as well. It does start to really create that pattern very, very quickly. So once you've done 2 rows, every 2 rows you're going to end up with a second set of stitches. So you can really start to see where the bumps are, and it does become much more evident so much more quickly. So one way to identify whether you've got an odd number of rows or an even number of rows is to look at where your starting tail is. If your starting tail is down on that bottom left hand side, your chain is working along the bottom, and then row 1 is working back towards the left and row 2 out towards the right. So if you look at where that is, if you've finished your row and your hook is in this top left hand corner, so if you finished on the same side as your yarn tail is at the beginning, then you have an odd number of rows. If you have finished on the opposite side to where your yarn tail is, then you have an even number of rows. So you can see, looking at where these bubbles are on the pattern, that you can get a really clear vision of where every 2 rows is. So each time you see a bump, that is 2 rows. So I count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'll times it by 2 because it's slightly easier, to be honest. So yes, you can really see the bubbles on these patterns, and you just count every pair of rows is the easiest way I find, and you will find that the bumps is just so much easier to see when you've worked a few rows. Then the back and the front, they do look the same. There is a slight offset because obviously you have worked slightly different stitches back and forth, and the fronts and backs of stitches, blah, blah, blah. But I will turn this around for you in a moment so you can see like what the back looks like as well. So this side, so yeah, it's much easier to count your rows in their pairs than it is doing one at a time. So this is the other side. The main difference you're going to see is with the shapes of the stitches at the top and the bottom. Otherwise, it's going to be mostly the same. It will be most noticeable at the tops and the bottoms where you only have the kind of odd rows that don't work up into those pairs. The great thing about this project is it doesn't really have a right side and a wrong side. So now when we're adding our tassels, it's not very important which side is the right side and wrong side because they look mostly the same. To create our tassels, we're going to be using this really high-tech bit of kit called a piece of cardboard. I like to use a piece of thick cardboard cut to half the length of the tassel that I want. So if you think about it, this is actually going to be the length of the tassel at the end of it because we're going to fold it over in 2. And so once, you know, it's been around here, that'll be what it is, the folding length of 2. So whatever you want the length of your tassel to be at the end of your scarf, cut your piece of cardboard so that it's that length. I then cut a little notch into it so it holds it on, so I'm not having to like awkwardly go around everything. And this is a bit of a process, but you do just want to wrap and wrap and wrap and wrap and wrap until you have as many wraps as you want tassels. So for mine, I'm going to be working 2 tassels per stitch. So on either end, I'm going to need 60 lengths of yarn. This is one of the ways also that we're going to make sure that our project doesn't have a right side and a wrong side because we're going to work our tassels one way and then the other way. We'll get to that now. So once you have wrapped your chosen number of wraps around your piece of cardboard, simply take your scissors to them. The sharper the better. These scissors are awful. If you've watched any of my other videos before, you know that I just have awful scissors all the time. And you just literally cut along the side. So the same side that you cut your notch to hold the yarn at the beginning and the end, you're going to cut along that side because that means that you're going to have lots and lots of lovely, lovely tassels. And it will cut through everything. It's super straightforward. As I say, nothing about this project is particularly difficult. The main hard thing is that when you do have your pile of tassels is separating them again because they will stick to each other. You get this kind of cousin-it situation out of your cut bits of tassel. So once you have managed to wrestle one part of tassel away from the other, you're going to fold it in half and give yourself a loop. You're then going to take your scarf and you're going to work it into the chain or the top of stitch if it is the end side of, like, go through that with your hook, then put the loop onto your hook, and then with the 2 yarn ends you're going to pull those straight through the loop, so you're tying it on nice and tightly. You want to make sure that you're working one into each stitch as you go. There are other options for tassels, but this is kind of how I wanted to do it for this one. I think it's the most straightforward way to do it, and B, it just looks super cute as well at the end. So we're going to make sure we're keeping our scarf facing us and doing one tassel into each stitch all the way along. I don't know why I started in the middle of this. I just felt like it, I think. So yeah, you're going to make sure you're going into the top of each stitch and into the side of each chain as well on the other end. So you're pulling through, you're folding your little tassel length over into half, putting your hook through to pull the loop through, and then pull that all back through together. Once you've done one into each stitch, this is what it's going to look like, and frankly it's a bit sparse. So in order to also make sure that we're getting our right side and wrong side looking, you know, the same, we're going to flip our scarf over. And I'm not going to lie, I did attempt to do some sort of click transition thing there, but I forgot to film the other side of it, so we skip over that. And you do see the kind of the difference, that how it looks on the back as it did to the front. And all we're going to do is we're going to, into the top of each stitch again, we're going to work another tassel, and you want to make sure that you're working them in between the ones on the other side, so you'll start to see the difference where you've got the kind of V look of what you've just put in, and then the bump as well from the other side. So you will continue to work a tassel between each of the tassels from the previous row, so you end up with 2 tassels in each stitch as you go across. This is going to give you quite nice density to your tassels, so that it kind of sits nicely. If you prefer it to be sparser, you can make it sparser. If you want to comb out the stitches so that fluffs it up a bit, you can. There's so many different ways you can do this. This is just how I've chosen to do so. If you do want to partition these stitches, I just take your needle or some sort of comb or something. I find it easier with my yarn needle, and then just separate the strands, and you get this kind of fuzzy looking thing. Honestly, it's super time consuming, and I'm not the biggest fan of how it looks compared to just keeping the strands as they are, but that is the option for you. This one is longer than the others because it is my yarn tail from the end, which I did end up pulling through one of my tassels as well, so you can just see the kind of effect that has. I just wanted to show you the effect and how you would go about it, but for the most part I've kept my scarf with the full stitches together because I just think that looks much nicer. If you wanted to create a shorter tassel, then pulling the tassels apart would be nice, or what you could do is separate the fibres, and you can wet them in order to make them less crinkly as well. So the next thing that you want to do is to just give your scarf a trim, give the tassels a trim to make sure that they are even. These, I try to do with the scissors here, but these scissors are so bad that it barely got it, and I was having a bit of a fight. So you can see here that I've had a bit of a struggle to give it a haircut. I did get there in the end, but in order to make it straight, what you can do is take your tassel measure and just lay it across the stitches. So brush the stitches up so they're all kind of sitting nice and flat, and then just use your tassel measurer, and then you can line it up. You can kind of comb it up like so, and then just trim off the stitches there. This is where I failed miserably with the scissors. I was like, yeah, I can cut this, and then I just gave up because it just was too hard. Immediately, of course, after filming this video, I then found my good scissors, but by that time I was unprepared, and it was all finished. But that is the end of the scarf. You have made it. Obviously, you're going to repeat this process on both ends of your scarf as you cut. Then why do I persist with these scissors? I don't understand. I need to just find the good scissors and put them in place. And then what I actually end up with here is lots of red nail varnish marks on my white background. But there you go, your scarf is nice and finished. I'm super, super happy with it. I really love the texture. I think it's really nice and true to what we have in the actual scarves that you can buy from Taylor. And it's just, yeah, it's a really nice all-rounder as well. There we go, we have these shots again because I actually really like the photo shoot I did. I'm really pleased with how this turned out, and I can't wait to see other people's scarves as well. Thanks for watching!